Right. We're in the home stretch. I see a few yawns out there, so I want to make sure we end on time so y'all can get a nap this afternoon. All right, we're ready to start with Esther. Y'all see the Esther. Esther and Persian rug, right? Persian cat. Yes, there she is. But the book of Esther is a really one of those fun books. It's not too long in terms of reading, but it's a glimpse into the life of the faithful community that's behind the scenes during the time of the Babylonian exile, and now the Persian exile and rule. Esther's part of the Jewish diaspora who didn't come back with the group that came back to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So she, like Daniel, is still working and operating behind the scenes. And this is probably why this book has been really amongst the Jewish community one popular book. We'll talk about the Feast of Purim, which is outside of the Bible developed, I should say not a commanded feast or festival, like the Feast of Booths, like the ones that Moses prescribed in the Torah. This comes out of the book of Esther, but there's a celebration recognizing God's faithfulness in the midst of, in this particular historical event of protecting this tragedy that could have taken place with regards to the Jewish diaspora. So what's interesting is that you think of the Jewish history from biblical times to present, Jews are pretty used to being exiled. They're out there and spread out all over the world in various different places and communities. So they identify with a book like Esther pretty well. So they can relate to the book. One of the heroes of the book, Mordecai, is going to rise, we'll see, in a position of power. And we've seen this before in a foreign land. We're reminded of the prophet Daniel at this point, how God uses these seemingly, they're average people, but they're people of faith. And because of their unique placement, God uses in a very dramatic fashion. So Esther with her cousin Mordecai reminds us of Daniel, reminds us of Joseph, rising in power in Egypt. Remember him? So an Israelite in a non-Israelite context, God using in a significant way. So that's what we have in the book of Esther. And we've seen this chart before, but where we put the book of Esther is kind of gapped in between Zerubbabel and when we pick up the story with Ezra. Esther is in this 57-year gap. So right on top of the Xerxes the First was her Persian king that she ends up becoming queen with. So that's where we are in terms of history. I hope this next picture doesn't throw anybody for a loop. But one of the things about the book of Esther is it doesn't mention God. That's why I put this picture up here and covering the private parts. So, all right. Yeah, it's kind of a unique book that it's not even mentioning God by name. Yahweh or Elohim is not found in the entire book. So how did this book find its way into the canon? Well, what we'll be surprised about is how subtly the author refers to God behind the scenes, working behind the scenes. We're going to see a lot of subtlety in the description and the words that are used to understand God is at work through this scenario, working through these people. And it's subtly referred to, even though his name isn't being used. All right, we'll get off that picture. So King Xerxes was also the Persian king. In the movie 300, we've all seen that great, fantastic movie. The Spartans, their stronghold, and they're taking on the Persians, trying to invade right up here in the upper left, they got stopped at Greece. Thankfully, if they hadn't gotten stopped, Europe would be a little different place than it is today in terms of world history. But Xerxes lost the war against the Greeks, and that halted his expansion westward in terms of his operation. But you can see how widespread his kingdom did at its greatest point. So now we're in the context of a Persian king, Xerxes. He's expanding his kingdom, and you can see how successful he was. So he's very boastful, and that fits right into the context. We start right in with chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. We see the extravagance of these Persian kings. Now, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, which is Xerxes the first, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. That's important to know. Provinces, broken down, manageable political chunks of Persia. In those days, as king, Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was in Susa, the capital. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes in attendance, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days. 180-day festival. Every day is the same as the day before. How great is this Persian king Xerxes the first? Well, he's great. Let's see it tomorrow one more time. And when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Susa, the capital, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Oh, do I want to stop there? No. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen, silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver, starts to sound like Solomon again, on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty, and the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So that fits right well into these Persian kings weren't taking worship like they weren't stepping in and saying, hey, everybody, worship me, I'm a god. That's not quite like that. That happened in other contexts. But they did like their praise. They did like to be, the center of everybody's attention. Their title, the Persian kings, oftentimes were given the title King of Kings. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? But they weren't considered to be a god. All right, so there's a distinction there. Here is Xerxes from archaeology. So, and there he is on a coinage. Pretty handsome guy. So you can see why he was so popular and so dominant in the world. And he had a beard. So a lot of you guys with beards, beards go way back. But we see that a conflict is immediately set up here in the text between this king and his queen, Vashti. And when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehamam, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, Carcass. I don't say those names every day. And 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. That's another thing to be kind of proud and arrogant about. Look how beautiful my queen is, everyone, right? But what does she do, right? She refuses to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became angry, and his wrath burned within him. So the conflict here is set up. So this precipitates a huge political quandary or risk for this Persian king. He's not going to want to lose face, right? he's not going to show a little Achilles heel of potential weakness here. A Persian king who can't even command his own household? What kind of king is this, you know? His wife, who wears the royal pants in this household? So he issues a decree here to solve the problem and perhaps save face here. And we see the details in verses 19 through 22. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti should come no more into the presence of King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who's more worthy than she. And when the king's edict which he shall make is heard throughout all of his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. I'm not going to impact just my own household, but all the households of my country. And this word pleased the kings and princes, and the king did as Memucan purposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, each province according to script, and every people according to their language. Every man should be the master in his own house, and that one who speaks in the language of his own people. So then he orders her to be replaced in chapter 2, and we see that in verses 2 through 4. So what he's going to do is go replace her and try to replace her beauty, because he wants someone else to be boastful and proud about. All right. And then we have an introduction, a short introduction here to Mordecai. So Mordecai, there he is riding on his white horse. And let's see here. Let's see. Jonathan, are you here? Yeah. Why don't you read for us 5 and 6?
Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away.
Okay. So there's a little historical context that we have there. If we turn back to 2 Kings, if you want to turn back there with me, we see the context of helping us to know what deportation we're talking about here. 2 Kings chapter 24, beginning in verse 14. This was near the end of the up to and near the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, but not quite, because we have this deportation in verses 14 through 16. Why don't you keep reading there?
14 to 16?
Yeah, in 2 Kings 24.
He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officials, and the chief men of the land he took into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and the metal workers, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war.
Yeah, okay, down through verse 16. So, this was the second deportation, right, before the final destruction of Jerusalem. This deportation, this Jeconiah in verse 6 in Esther is the same king. He's just got it. It's the same king as Jehoiachin in verse 15. So those are the same kings. So that drops right into the middle of this. Mordecai would have been on the same exile train as the prophet Ezekiel, for example, in that second deportation. Daniel and his friends would have been in the first deportation that happened before. So 3 waves of deportees were taken out of Jerusalem and the vicinity to go back under the Babylonians. So this is Mordecai was very much like Daniel, hanging around in this, outside of this foreign land for some time. So God is raising up these individual Israelites and preparing them for great things. I think I can make the case for Mordecai. He's coming out of a believing faith community. He's like, what I've said before, where are these people coming from? Knowing what to do, knowing how to trust in the Lord. I mean, they have had praying grandmas growing up in church, some kind of an experience where they understand who God is, they have experience trusting him, and now they're being prepared and used for something that's going to push them to the edge, you know. Yeah, sure.
Do you think maybe, sorry, I got a cold.
Mm-hmm.
Mordecai may have not been as faithful as many people might portray him recently. He didn't go back, to his homeland. It maybe also the fact that, his Esther, as he's the guardian of her, he kind of doesn't speak against Esther marrying.
Yeah.
And there's no, you don't see them praying, or there's no God, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're not in the Esther is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Certain things that, to me, that point to where do we really see them depend on God like Daniel did? Are they a little different?
Well, you're anticipating my discussion that's right around the corner.
Okay.
Because you're right, there's some discussion about the book that, I don't want to steal my thunder, because I've got a whole case built against Mordecai and Esther along some of the same lines. But I do that because I'm setting up the idea that, well, I'll talk about it more in just a little bit, but I think I'll answer your question. It's a good question. Yeah, the question was, how do we deal with Mordecai? He's there. He's part of this. I could ask the same thing about Daniel. Why didn't he go back with the faithful Jews? I think part of the answer is they may have realized that their particular placement was God's hand at work. Not all of the Jews went back, so they needed. By this time, he has a particularly important job in service in the king's court. So maybe something like that. But we'll see some bits and pieces and hints along the way that I think this is a praying bunch. Even though we don't see the word prayer, we don't see the word God, it's going on all around. There's fasting. We're going to see that. So where do you have fasting without prayer? So some of it we have to fill in some of the gaps a little bit, but I think we can do it safely and not make the text say more than it was intended to say. So, all right. So after Mordecai, we're introduced to Hadassah. We see that in verse 7. Well, actually, I'll just turn the page here. Like Mordecai, now Esther, verse 7. And he, that is Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we have Hadassah's Hebrew name that means myrtle. That's what it means in Hebrew. She's lost both parents, and Mordecai's an older cousin here, taking her into his household and raising her as his own daughter. Esther's probably stems from her Persian name, a Persian word that sounds somewhat similar that means star. So we've got some naming going on here. All right. So Mordecai continues to look out for his younger cousin, and he's going to warn her. Well, let's look at verses 8 and 9. Mordecai is now, like Mordecai, Esther now is going to find favor in the court of the king. And it came about when the command and decree of the king was heard, many young ladies were gathered to Susa, the capital, in the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's palace under the custody of Haggai, who was in charge of the women. And the young lady pleased him, that is the king, and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best palace in the harem. And then verse 10, we have the warning of Mordecai. Esther, though, did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. All right. So Mordecai's looking out for his cousin. Don't tell him what nation or race you're from. Don't tell him that you're a Jew. And King Xerxes, it seems, was interested in more than just beauty. It turns out that it's her turn to spend the night in the king's palace. And this too pleases the king. We have chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came to go in to the king, she did not request anything except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther, in a way, is finding her role, although controversial, in the service of the king and in the king's palace. But here's where I want to be a little ornery, so I'm going to paint a different picture. You kind of anticipated it. Mordecai encourages Esther to lie and to remain deceitful about who she really is. Unlike Daniel and his friends, Esther does not refuse to eat the king's choice food. Cross-reference Daniel chapter 1. Remember the story of Daniel? Esther chose to follow through with the 6 days of beautification, which was a pagan practice, whereas Esther could have relied on her natural beauty, like Queen Vashti. Vashti was standing up to the king in terms of his obsession with this beauty thing. She didn't stand up like Vashti. Finally, Esther commits adultery, and she doesn't become queen until after she's had sex with the king. And Esther agrees to intermarriage, marriage to a pagan king. Wasn't this a huge problem? Wasn't this the big problem of Ezra and Nehemiah, intermarriage? Where's she getting her guidance here? Why didn't Mordecai speak up? Don't do this. So we have 2 Jews in exile who are compromising their Jewish identity and are not staying true to Jewish laws and the teaching of Moses. So now, break up into your groups. Talk about this. Can we go a different direction here? All right, you're gonna put me to shame now. Come up, put your thinking cap on. I do this with my kids. Put your thinking cap on. Are they chatting about this? That's a good question.
And he played all the strings.
All right, what'd y'all come up with? How are we to kind of lay a little foundation here instead of jumping off the cliff? Any ideas?
It's hard to find any biblical character that there's not a lot of moral compromises already.
That's true.
Abraham denied that Sarah was his wife on several occasions.
Right.
Moses murdered a guy. David and Bathsheba.
Hebrew midwives,
Mhm.
they lied.
All of them did some pretty messy things.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yes, sir.
Well, it's kind of a foil to Joseph because Joseph was in similar situations, and he's one of the only characters we don't see explicitly sin against God in this type of circumstance. But I think kind of as a foil to Joseph, it shows that the Lord's purposes are going to be upheld. So does he want to deliver the Jews? Absolutely. Does he choose to do so through whoever he chooses to do it through? Yeah. Even though Esther wasn't as faithful to the law or to what she knew of the law as Daniel was or as Joseph was, the Lord still accomplished his purpose through her.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to, right around the corner here, I'm going to make the case that Esther had her lion's den experience, just like Daniel did. You know, she's going to have a similar, die this direction. I got, no place to go except for trusting in the Lord. So I'll make a case. We're gonna rebuild this thing in a proper way, I think. But I think that it's interesting. Well, anybody else have any ideas?
Had let the origin be known before, and it would have been less impactful as well.
Yeah, that's true. There seems to be. That's a good point. There seems to be a kind of the timing of everything is really important to the series of events that take place. You're right. The context was not, I mean, at their defense, the context that they're trying to deal with the events of daily life was not back in Jerusalem. They weren't in the covenant community in Jerusalem where there was this emphasis, strong emphasis on don't intermarry and all of that. They're, in a way, they're prisoners, right? They're under the rule of the Persians. Yes, ma'am.
Well, one of the things we talked about was like in the ancient Near East, like if you were a female, you didn't get to call the shots.
That's no point.
Like,
so,
it's not like Esther had a choice. It's like, you're doing this, you don't get to say.
Well, yeah, and the kings issued a decree to bring in all the most beautiful women. She's part of this group. To rebel against that would be treason and to be killed. I mean, you choose to be killed or not to be killed. I mean, but the other side of that is, well, she could have chosen a martyr's death from the very first chapter, So it's interesting, the timing of it. It's a intricately woven, account and story. Things build as the story progresses. Now I'll explain this. So Mordecai is going to continue to earn more trust, and because we find out, foils an assassination attempt on the king. So we have that in verses 21 through 23. So Esther becomes queen right at the end of chapter 2. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai. He told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. When the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So it's interesting. Hitler had 6 failed assassination attempts on his life during his rule and reign. But this picture tells another story that's really relevant to the book of Esther. Esther's going to kind of reveal to us that there was this, by this time in history, this hatred towards the Jews. at a particular time in history. We're going to see that. And we're introduced to at least one person who had strong feelings against the Jews in chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. Now there's a history behind the term Agag, or the fact that Haman was an Agagite. Not that he graduated from Texas A&M and was an Aggie. This is a different kind of Agagite. All right, so chapter 3, verse 1. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 17 and look at the history behind the significance. Really, it's the history of why he would have hatred against the Jews. Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 and 9. So in the early days of Israel's history, we have 17, 8, and 9. There we go. So this early skirmish with the Amalekites. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us, go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua, let's just set up the battle with the Amalekites here. And then we turn over to verses 14 and 16. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in the book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." And he said, "The Lord has sworn the Lord will have war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." So there's this early, the Amalekites put at risk the early stages of God with his people and wiping out the Israelites. So there's unfinished business as we move ahead in history. If we turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now we're flash forward, and we're in the middle of Saul's reign. And interestingly, part of his disobedience, as he's fighting a battle now, chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. So he captures Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, fatlings, lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly. But everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, "I regret that I've made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands," from Exodus, right? And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. So this is the link to the king Agag, thus the Agagites. So distant relatives to the Amalekites is what we're talking about. And this was formerly, in the earliest of times, a nation or a people group that was seeking to blot out the Israelites through this early battle. So Haman, perhaps because of this history, has this extreme hatred towards the Jews. He's looking to try to settle this old score once and for all with any Jew he can find. So he might be motivated now because he's moved into this political sphere of influence to try to find the grand scheme, the scheme of all schemes that he could come up with to try to take out as many Jews as he can because of this long-standing scuttle between the Amalekites and the Jews in history. All right. So what we have next is that we have Mordecai is refusing to bow and pay homage to Haman. And we see this conflict between Haman and Mordecai only escalate. And now what we have is that it's threatening the entire group of Jews who are living in Jerusalem, really the whole diaspora of Jews. Chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. Let's see, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6. "And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai, like Daniel, neither bowed down nor paid homage." So there's one strike for Mordecai. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. So, verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So we're talking about the Jews who were spread out around all of the provinces of Persia. And what happens next, we have the king issuing another edict. So King Xerxes. Really, this edict is like no different than putting a bounty out on Jews who were scattered around all of these provinces in and around Persia. And even Haman is willing even to pay out of his own pocket for this project to advance. And we see it, pick it up in verse 8. Haman says to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain." There's some evidence of Haman pointing out that there's these pockets of Jews around here who are living differently. They're not falling in line with all of what the king of Persia is ordering. And then he says, "If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put into the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So it's interesting that Haman represents the Torah loyalty of these Jews who are in the scattered groups around. And this edict, obviously, by implication, is going to affect the folks back home in Jerusalem. And after this, King Xerxes and Haman sit and share a drink as the whole city rises in confusion over this decree. Pretty shocking decree to the community that's around. All right, so we'll leave Hitler behind and pick up the rest of the story, and we'll finish Esther next week, and then we'll finish Chronicles as well next week, I hope. Thanks for your attention today.